He held the pen as if it were the last thread keeping him alive. The war had already taken almost everything, his friends, his sleep, his hope. But what he still had was her. Her name was engraved on the paper at the top of the letter, as if each letter were a prayer. "My love, if you could see me now." Those were the first words he wrote that winter night in 1944, inside a trench covered in snow and fear. While the sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance, he found refuge in something no enemy could destroy: the memory of the one he loved. He believed that words could cross the ocean, that paper carried a piece of the soul, and that, somehow, she would read it, even if she never replied. But what he didn't know was that the letter would never be read, because the woman he was writing to was no longer alive. Some stories were not made to be forgotten. They were written in letters, buried under time, waiting for someone to read them again. And if what you're about to hear touches your heart, then maybe it will finally be read. Leave your heart in this story and subscribe so that no letter is left unanswered. The story begins in 1943 when soldier Elliot Hayes, 27 years old, boarded a ship to Europe. He was just a farmer from the Kansas countryside, used to the smell of wet earth and the sound of wind through the cornfields. But when the newspapers began announcing that the world was at war, he believed it was his duty to go. Before leaving, he left behind Clara, his fiancée, a teacher at the small-town school. They had met as teenagers. He was fixing the school roof, and she watched him from the window, laughing at the clumsy way he balanced the hammer. That laugh was the most beautiful thing Elliot had ever heard, and it never left his mind. On the eve of his departure, he promised her he would return, that he would write every day, and that the letters would be the thread keeping them connected, even across the distance. And he kept his word. Every night, under the dim light of a candle, he wrote. He talked about the snow, the smell of gunpowder, the friends who laughed even when they were afraid. But above all, he talked about her, about memories, dreams, and a future he swore he would build once it was all over. The letters were always sent to the same address, Clara Thompson, 218 Maple Street, Topeka, Kansas, but none of them received an answer. Elliot thought the mail was slow. The war mixed everything up. But there was something he couldn't imagine. Clara never read any of those letters. She had died 6 months after he left. A car accident on a slippery road coming home after a class. The news was sent, but never reached the front. The army got lost in reports, and her name never appeared among the personal notices, so he kept writing, not knowing he was writing to a ghost. The letters became his refuge. In them he could still love, even though love was already gone. Some soldiers prayed, others drank, others fell silent. Elliot wrote, "Each word was an attempt to stay alive." One night, after an especially cruel battle in France, he hid behind a crumbling wall. Around him, bodies, smoke, screams. He took a crumpled sheet from his pocket and began to write again. "Clara, the sky tonight is red, as if even God has grown tired of war. I don't know if I'll come back, but if I don't, I want you to know that even without seeing me, you were the only thing that kept me standing. When fear comes, I think of your smile. And that's enough to make me believe there's still something good waiting at the end of all this." When he finished, he put the letter inside his coat and closed his eyes for a moment. That night he barely survived, but the letter was soaked in blood, not his, but his friends who had fallen beside him. And still, the next day, he sent it, because to Elliot, no letter could be left unfinished. Time passed, and the war slowly took what was left of his innocence. But he never stopped writing. Even when the fields fell silent, when his comrades stopped coming back, he continued. The words were the only thing keeping him human, and maybe deep down he already knew that he wasn't writing to be read, but to remember who he was before the war turned him into someone else. The following months were a mixture of silence and survival. Elliot no longer counted the days, only the letters. Each one was a mark in time, a reminder that he was still breathing. Battles had become routine, and death, a neighbor who knocked at the door every morning. But amid all that, the image of Clara was the one place war could never reach. In the rare hours of rest, he would move away from the noise of the other soldiers and sit alone, paper on his knees and a worn pencil in his hands. The field was covered in snow, but inside him there was a strange warmth, a fire that only burned when he thought of her. He wrote about the smell of the coffee she used to make on Sunday mornings, about the blue dress she wore to the fair, about the way she tied her hair when she laughed. Every memory was an escape from reality, a path back home. The letters became longer. He wrote about the war, but always ended with love. There were days when fear consumed him, yet he still wrote tenderly, as if the softness of his words could somehow keep him whole. Sometimes his tears stained the paper before the ink could dry. His companions started calling him the poet. They laughed when they saw him, head down, writing in the middle of chaos. "Hayes, you should write for the papers, not for a woman who never writes back," they'd say with tired laughter. Elliot smiled and said nothing. He knew they wouldn't understand. They had bottles of whiskey and letters from nurses. He had Clara, and that was all that mattered. With time, his letters grew darker. The war was reaching a point where no one spoke of victory anymore, only survival. Elliot began to feel that something was wrong. Clara's silence unsettled him more than the sound of gunfire. There was something in his heart whispering an impossible truth, but he refused to listen. One rainy night, while the wind howled outside, he wrote, "Clara, sometimes I feel that time isn't the same between us. Here every hour feels like a year, and there, where you are, everything must go on as usual. Maybe you don't want to answer anymore. Maybe you've moved on, and I'd understand if that's the case, but please, don't forget me. Don't forget what we were. I keep fighting for us, even when the world seems to fall apart. And if I don't come back, I want you to know that every bullet I dodged was out of love for you." He folded the paper carefully, sealed the envelope and tucked it close to his chest, inside his uniform. In the following days, that letter stayed with him, unsent. He told himself he'd wait for the next rest period to send it, but deep down he knew there was something about that letter that stopped him, as if part of him already sensed it might be the last one. In one of the final offensives before the end of the war, Elliot was wounded by shrapnel. It wasn't serious, but enough to pull him off the front lines. While recovering in an improvised hospital, he spent his days watching the nurses and imagining Clara there, tending to men who would return home as different versions of themselves. He dreamed of her touch, her gentle voice telling him everything would be all right. But when he opened his eyes, all he saw was a canvas ceiling and the metallic smell of blood and disinfectant. One afternoon, a nurse brought him a pile of delayed mail. There were letters from mothers, wives, brothers. Elliot waited, anxious, hoping that one of them was from Clara. But once again, nothing. No envelope with his name on it, no reply. He began to ask himself if the letters were really reaching her. Maybe the military post was lost, maybe the town had changed, maybe she had simply stopped believing. The doubt consumed him, but his love was still stronger. So he wrote again. "My love, today the doctor said I'll be fine soon. He said I'll be able to go home soon, and all I can think about is you. I imagine opening the door, smelling your cooking, seeing you smile. I don't know if you'll be there, but if you are, I promise I'll never leave you again. I've lost too many friends, Clara. I can't lose you too." He signed it, but didn't have the strength to send it. The letter stayed under his pillow with the others. Weeks turned into months. The sound of bombs was replaced by rumors of peace. The troops began to return. The war was finally ending, but Elliot didn't feel joy. He felt a strange weight in his chest, an anxiety he couldn't explain. Something told him that the end of the war wouldn't be the end of his waiting. When the ship departed back to the United States, he looked behind him, watching Europe fade into the horizon. All he wanted now was to see her again, to hand her every letter, to tell her he'd survived. He kept the envelopes in a small wooden box tied with a cord, as if they were treasure. During the voyage, he opened one of the old letters and read softly, "When fear comes, I think of your smile." Those words, written months before, now sounded like an echo from another life. He had read them so many times, he already knew them by heart. When he arrived in Kansas, the sun was shining, and the air smelled of corn and damp soil. The little town looked exactly the same, but Elliot felt that he no longer was. The uniform still weighed on his shoulders, and the silence of those who stayed home was louder than any explosion. He walked the dirt road to Clara's house. Each step carried years of longing. His heart pounded as if trying to escape his chest. When he reached the gate, he saw the garden was different. The flowers she once cared for with such affection were gone. In their place, weeds and silence. Elliot climbed the 3 steps to the porch and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Then the door opened, not by her but by an elderly woman he didn't know. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking at his worn uniform and tired face. "I'm looking for Clara Thompson," Elliot replied, his voice trembling. The woman lowered her eyes. She was silent for a few seconds before saying, "I'm sorry, son. Clara passed away. It's been more than a year." The world stopped. Elliot didn't feel the ground beneath him. For a moment, there was no air, no sound, no war. Only emptiness. He looked at the old woman, waiting for her to say it was a mistake, that there had been some confusion, but she just watched him with compassion. "She was a good girl," the woman continued. "So young. Everyone in town was devastated. But who are you?" Elliot couldn't answer. His hands were shaking. The wooden box slipped from his grasp and hit the floor, scattering letters across the porch. The wind began to carry them away, one by one, as if fate wanted to erase the proof of a love that time had buried. And he just stayed there, on his knees, watching the letters fly, taking with them everything that was left of his heart. The wind scattered the letters across the ground, and Elliot gathered them with trembling hands, trying to save every piece of paper, every word he had written with so much love. The old woman watched in silence, unsure of what to say. To her, he was just another soldier returning home, carrying the invisible weight of a war no one truly understood. Elliot stood up slowly, clutching the handful of worn, yellowed letters to his chest. The woman invited him inside, and he followed quietly. The house still smelled of old wood and memories. The clock on the wall, the one he had once fixed himself, still marked the hours with the same steady rhythm, as if time had never passed. The woman served him coffee and explained that she was Clara's aunt. After the accident, no one had the courage to touch her things. The room remained intact, as if she might return at any moment. Elliot asked to see it. When he entered, his throat tightened. Everything was exactly as he remembered. The books stacked on the desk, the blue dress hanging behind the door, the faint scent of dried flowers in the air. On the table sat a photograph, Clara smiling, sunlight on her face, her hair loose in the wind. He approached and ran his fingers over the glass, as if he could touch her through it. "She used to talk about you," said the aunt softly, leaning against the doorway. "Said she loved you more than anything in this world. She waited for you every day." Elliot said nothing. His throat was closed. He just nodded, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. Silently, he took one of the letters from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "This one was for her," he murmured, "but I guess it'll never reach her now." The woman looked at him with tenderness. Maybe she's already read it, somehow. He stayed there for a long time, just looking at the room, letting the memories fill every corner of his soul. When he finally left, the sky was already darkening. The distant sound of a train echoed, as if the town itself was breathing slowly again. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. He sat in the small room of the inn where he was staying, the letters spread across the bed. Each envelope was a piece of him. Fragments of hope, love, and pain. He opened one and began to read again, but the words felt like they came from a man he no longer was. "My love, the day is cold, but when I think of you, I feel warm." He closed his eyes and saw her face in his mind, the laugh, the gaze. And for the first time, he realized he had been speaking to someone who no longer existed, that all that remained were paper and memories. In the days that followed, he started visiting the cemetery. He would sit in front of the simple gravestone that bore her name, Clara Thompson, 1918-1944. No quotes, no poetry, just a name and 2 dates, as if a whole life could be reduced to 2 lines of stone. Elliot stayed there for hours, reading aloud the letters that had never been delivered. The wind carried his words away, and he imagined that somehow they reached her. "Clara, today the field was covered in snow, the same white as your dress, the same cold as the day I left. You know, sometimes I think I still hear your voice. Maybe I'm just going mad, but that's how I survive. I keep talking to you, even if no one else listens." People began to notice the lonely man who spent his days in the cemetery, whispering letters to a woman who couldn't answer. Some called him the letter soldier, others just looked at him with pity, but Elliot didn't care. To him, those letters were still alive. One afternoon, as he was reading, the wind blew hard and carried one of the pages away. It flew over the cemetery wall and landed in the hands of a little girl walking with her mother. Curious, the girl gave it to her. The woman read the letter silently, then looked at the man sitting by the grave. There was something in that gesture that deeply moved her. The next day, she returned and left flowers on Clara's grave. Without knowing it, Elliot's love had begun to spread beyond what he could see. But inside him, the sadness grew heavier. There was no war that could defeat the emptiness of absence. He tried to return to a normal life, working on the farm, meeting old friends again, but everything felt too small. Other people's laughter sounded distant, as if from another world. At night, he wrote new letters, even knowing they would never be read. Yet each word brought him closer to her. He no longer wrote expecting an answer. He wrote to keep existing. "Clara, sometimes I think love is this, to keep writing even when no one is on the other side, to keep believing even when time has taken everything away. If love is a form of resistance, then I am still fighting." The seasons passed and the small inn room filled with paper. There were letters in drawers, under the mattress, inside books, all addressed to the same name. A curious neighbor once asked if he had someone waiting for him. Elliot simply replied, "She'll always be waiting." One night, he walked to the lake where he and Clara used to go together. He carried with him one of the first letters he had ever written, now yellowed and fragile. He sat at the water's edge, watching the reflection of the moon. Then he opened the envelope, read it one last time, and let it go. The letter floated for a few seconds before slowly sinking, as if time itself were taking it back. In that moment, he realized that maybe writing was no longer enough, that there was nothing more to say. Still, when he returned home, he sat at his desk and began another letter. His hands trembled, but the words came out like a confession, like a final breath of something that didn't know how to die. "Clara, I don't know if there's anything after this, but if there is, I want to find you there. It doesn't matter how long it takes or how many lives I live. I promise I will still find you." He sealed the envelope and placed it with the others, not knowing it would be the last time he would ever write her name. The days began to lose their shape, blending between sunrise and sunset, as if time itself had stopped making sense. Elliot lived on autopilot, waking up, eating little, walking to the cemetery, returning home, and sitting at night in front of the table, staring into nothingness. Silence had become part of him, and even the words he wrote seemed to echo inside an empty space with no return. The townspeople treated him with respect, but also with distance. Everyone knew he had returned from the war a different man. Some said he had left his soul in Europe. Others believed that the love he lost had taken him along with Clara, leaving behind only his body. And perhaps they were all right. One morning, as he opened the window, Elliot saw a pile of letters on the table. The same ones he had written over the past years. Some were torn, others wrinkled, all marked by coffee stains, tears, and time. He ran his hand across them and realized he no longer remembered when he had written each one. It was as if they had been written by someone else, a man who no longer existed. He picked up one envelope and began to read. "Clara, when I think of you, I feel that the war still hasn't ended." He closed his eyes, and for a moment the distant sound of bombs returned, along with the screams and the smell of smoke. He was still there somehow, trapped between the sound of the past and the silence of the present. He decided he couldn't go on like that. He needed to find a way to end the story, or at least give it meaning. He gathered the letters into a box, tied it with a ribbon, and walked to Clara's aunt's house. He knocked on the door and waited. The woman, surprised, smiled kindly and invited him in. "I need to ask you something," he said softly. "These letters, they're all for her. I want to leave them with you. Maybe somehow they still belong to this house." Clara's aunt took the box carefully. Her eyes filled with tears. "I'll take care of them, Elliot, I promise." He nodded. "That's all I can leave behind." Before he left, she stopped him for a moment. "You know, I sometimes think love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form. Maybe these letters are the way God found to keep you going." Elliot tried to smile, but his face felt too heavy. He thanked her, put on his hat, and left. In the following days, the town slowly returned to its rhythm. Children played in the streets again, the church bells rang on Sundays, and the sound of farm machines filled the air. But Elliot continued to walk without hurry, as if carrying a weight that time could never lift. Sometimes he stopped in front of the bookstore window where Clara used to buy books and stared at the new editions. He remembered the day she had dragged him there to buy a book of poems and made him promise he would read every day, even during the war. He had never kept that promise, but deep down he knew those letters had become his book of poems. One afternoon, the postman came looking for him. "Mr. Hayes, the post office sent this back by mistake. Looks like an old return." It was a yellowed envelope with faded stamps and travel marks. In the corner, his own name, Elliot Hayes. On the recipient line, Clara Thompson. And in small letters, the stamp read, "Address invalid. Return to sender." Elliot froze, staring at the envelope. It was one of the first letters he had ever sent, the ink almost gone, the paper thin, hope still alive. He opened it carefully. Inside were his own words, returning to him like a distant echo. "My love, if you can see me now, know that every beat of my heart is still yours. I'll come home, and when I do, I'll come for you." The tears came without warning. He sat on the porch, watching the horizon, the sun sinking behind the golden fields. The world seemed at peace, but inside him was a war that would never end. That night he wrote again, but this time the letter was different. "Clara, Today I received one of the letters I sent you. It came back to me as if time itself had come full circle. Maybe it's a sign. Maybe you're trying to tell me I can stop now. I don't know, but I feel my heart growing tired. The letters kept me alive, but now they only remind me of what I lost. If there's a place where souls meet again, I hope you wait for me there. Until that day, I'll keep silent. With love, Elliot. He folded the paper and placed it inside the returned envelope, sealing the past with his own hands. After that, he went to the cemetery less often. He spent more time at home, sitting on the porch, watching the sky change colors. People noticed he spoke less, but seemed calmer. It was as if, after so many years, he had found a strange kind of peace. Not because he had forgotten, but because he had finally accepted. The years went by. Elliot's hair turned grey, and his once steady hands now trembled when holding a pen. Yet sometimes he still wrote, short phrases on scraps of paper, loose thoughts he kept inside a brown-covered book. Maybe true love doesn't need to be returned. Maybe it exists only to remind us that a heart can still feel. Time, once cruel, now seemed gentler. The pain became part of his routine, and the memory of Clara a quiet comfort. He no longer cried when thinking of her. He simply smiled with longing. One spring afternoon, Elliot walked once more to the cemetery. He carried flowers and the old book that held his writings. Sitting before the gravestone, he stayed silent for a long while. Then he opened the book, took out the last piece of paper, and read softly, "If love is a war, Clara, then I fought until the end." He placed the paper on the stone and stood slowly. The wind blew, carrying the note to the foot of a nearby tree. Elliot looked up at the sky and, for a moment, swore he could smell her perfume in the air. The breeze passed gently like a touch, and he closed his eyes, letting time take him back to where it all began. A wheat field, a smile in the sunlight, and a promise made under the distant sound of bells. The years kept passing, quietly, like leaves falling from a tree that had long accepted winter. Elliot grew old in a small house, in the same town that held all the memories the world had forgotten. His hair was now white, his gaze softer, but his heart still carried the same name, Clara. He had become a familiar figure among the few townsfolk who remained. The children saw him on the porch, always with a book in his hands, and called him the man of the letters. He would smile kindly, and when someone asked what he was writing, he'd say, "Letters to Time. It's the only one still listening." The box with the old letters sat on top of a wooden dresser in his room. From time to time, Elliot would open it and reread one or two, not out of sadness, but out of tenderness. The words no longer hurt. They sounded like a distant song that followed him softly. There were nights when he lit a candle and wrote another letter. His hands trembled, but his handwriting was still steady enough to say what his heart never forgot. Clara, the garden bloomed again today. The same flowers you planted still grow without asking for anything in return. I think that's what love is supposed to be. Something that keeps going even when no one's watching. He would fold the paper and place it inside the brown book, the same one he'd used for decades, and somehow he felt at peace. In time, he began receiving visits from a young reporter from the local paper. She was writing a story about war veterans, and someone had told her about the soldier of the letters. At first, Elliot resisted. He said his story wasn't important, but little by little, the young woman's voice, gentle, curious and respectful, convinced him to open up. For weeks, she visited him every afternoon. She carried a recorder but rarely turned it on. She preferred to listen. Elliot spoke slowly, telling not only of the war, but of the love that survived it. The reporter took notes, often moved to tears. "Do you think she's still there somewhere?" she asked one day. Elliot looked at the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the hills. "I think love is a form of eternity," he said. "It doesn't disappear. It just changes places. And when I close my eyes for the last time, I know I'll find her, not in a heaven full of angels, but in a wheat field, with the wind blowing and her laughing like the first time." The reporter smiled, her eyes wet. "May I publish that?" "You may," he replied. "Write it however you like. What matters is that someone remembers, that someone reads what was once written out of love." The article was published a few weeks later, titled, "The Letters Time Couldn't Erase." The story touched the entire town. People began sending letters to Elliot, strangers who said they were moved, who had lost someone and found comfort in his words. He replied to all of them with slow but tender handwriting. "Thank you for reading. Love only dies when we stop talking about it." The small post office had never seen so much mail. Letters arrived from everywhere. Some came from faraway countries, marked with foreign stamps. Elliot kept them all in a new box, separate from the old one. He called it the world's replies. One afternoon, the reporter returned, bringing a surprise. She had found the grave of one of Elliot's comrades, the soldier who had died beside him. She told him that someone often left flowers there, though no one knew who. Elliot stayed silent for a long time, then said, "War takes bodies, but never the bonds. Someone always remembers. There's always someone still writing." That night he lit a candle and wrote another letter, perhaps the shortest of them all. "Clara, the world still has love. I know because I've seen it bloom in the hands of people who never knew you but cried for us. I think that's what they call eternity, when the love of two hearts touches the hearts of many." He placed the paper inside the book and closed his eyes for a moment. The wind blew outside, sounding just like it had all those years ago when he wrote in the cold trenches. The following days were peaceful. Elliot spent his mornings on the porch, his afternoons reading, and his nights in silence. His body had grown weak, and the town doctor visited him from time to time, telling him to rest more. He would just smile and reply, "I'm already resting. I'm only waiting for the right moment." One morning, the postman knocked on the door, but no one answered. The door was slightly open. He stepped inside, calling out the old soldier's name. Elliot was sitting in his chair, his face serene, his eyes closed. On his lap lay an envelope. On his chest, a faint smile. The postman approached carefully and saw the name written on the envelope. Clara Thompson. Inside there was a single line. "My love, I've finally found the way." The funeral was simple. A few friends, some neighbors, and the young reporter. She placed the brown book on the coffin, as she had promised. Inside were the letters, the memories, and the proof that love can outlast time, distance, and even death. When it was all over, the postman took the envelope and placed it on Clara's grave. The wind blew softly, opening the paper and revealing the handwriting, aged by the years but still alive. "My love, I've finally found the way." And the wind carried the words into the air, as if returning them to where they had come from, the same sky that had once separated two hearts that never stopped searching for each other. Time went on, as it always does, but it left gentle traces in the small town where Elliot and Clara had lived their story of love and loss. The cemetery, once the silent refuge of a man with a broken heart, had become nothing more than a peaceful garden, where the wind whispered through the flowers and the rustling trees sounded like an old song. As the decades passed, the story of the soldier of the letters took on a life of its own. People began telling it as a local legend, a tale grandparents would share with their grandchildren before bed. Some said that on certain winter nights you could still see a man in a hat sitting beside a gravestone, writing under the moonlight. Others swore they could hear soft footsteps and the faint sound of paper being folded. For most, though, Elliot became a symbol, not of sadness, but of love that endures. His name started appearing in newspapers, on radio programs, and in books about the Second World War. His letters were kept in a local museum, displayed in a small glass case. Above them a simple plaque read, "For Clara, the love time could not take away." Visitors came from far away to see those yellowed pages, some stained with tears, others filled with lines of hope. Many stood silently, others wept quietly. There was something in those letters that spoke more about life than about death. Among the visitors, one day, a little girl asked her mother, "Wasn't he sad that she died?" Her mother smiled softly and said, "Yes, he was. But he never stopped loving her, and maybe that's what kept her from ever really dying." Years later, the young reporter who had once told Elliot's story became a well-known writer. In every book she published, there was always a hidden dedication at the end. For Elliot and Clara, who taught me that love doesn't have to last to be eternal. The museum grew, and so did the town. But the graves of Clara and Elliot remained simple, side by side, with a small inscription carved between their names. Together, at last. Flowers were left there almost every day. No one knew exactly by whom. Perhaps by visitors, perhaps by someone who believed the letters still floated in the air. One autumn afternoon, the sun was setting slowly, painting the sky in shades of gold. The wind passed gently through the trees, and a single leaf drifted down, landing softly on the gravestone. On it, written by hand in faded blue ink, were the words, "Some loves don't need an answer, they only need to be remembered." No one knew who had left it there. Maybe someone who had read the letters. Maybe someone who had loved and lost. Or maybe something else. And as night came, and the world grew quiet, the wind blew once more. It moved through the flowers, lifted the note, and carried it away. Across the cemetery, over the hill, disappearing into the stars. Some say that that night they saw two figures walking side by side in the fields beneath the soft glow of the moon. He in his old uniform, she in her blue dress, hand in hand, as if time itself had finally kept its promise. And perhaps it had, because there are loves that do not end. They only wait. And when time decides, they find each other again. Elliot and Clara were never just two people separated by war. They were proof that love can cross oceans, centuries, and even death itself. They were a reminder that some feelings don't need to be seen to be real. They only need to be felt. And if one day you hear the sound of paper being folded, or the soft whisper of wind at dusk, perhaps it's just a letter, traveling through time once more. A letter written by someone who loved so deeply that even forgetting could not silence it. And perhaps, when you hear it, your heart will understand that some stories never end, they only change shape. And that love, when it is true, never needs an answer. It simply keeps being written in silence for eternity,